another visual pictorial representation of how we talk about and show genetics. So a lot of you have already started your projects, or you've at least picked topics for your projects, right? What you're going to find out is, in some cases, a pedigree may be the way to include a graphic for your project. It may be a way that people communicate about how this disease is inherited, right? And it's also something that you may see in real life if you ever do any of those DNA tests, and or you have genetic counseling for some reason, right? They might use this as a tool to talk to you. So it's good to know about. But really, this is going to be kind of a, this is what it is virtual session. And then again, if you want to use it in your project, you can. Otherwise, right, you'll know what it is at the very least. So we're going to start with some vocabulary. And then we're going to have some people read. I just repasted the link, by the way, for those of you that are slightly late. So what is a pedigree? Well, it is a chart that shows the presence or absence of a trait within a family across generations. So what that means is we're looking at heritable diseases, right? Something that can be inherited from either a previous generation or 2 generations or whatever. In order to be able to read a pedigree or understand it, we also need to know these other words, which are things we've gone over before, right? The genotype, or the actual genetics, in this case, represented by letters. Big T is an example of a genotype. Phenotype, the physical characteristics, right? Is the organism tall? Is it short? Is it this? Is it that? Represented by a description, usually. Dominant and recessive alleles, right? Dominant alleles expressed. Recessive alleles are only expressed when there's no dominant alleles. Then we get 2 newer words, although I did mention these briefly. We have 2 different types of traits: autosomal traits and sex-linked traits. Autosomal traits are traits that are found on the non-sex chromosomes, which is most of the chromosomes, right? So chromosomes 1 through 22 and their pair are autosomal. Then we have our sex chromosomes, which is the last pair, which depending on male or female will be XY or XX. Sex-linked traits live on the X or the Y chromosome. Usually they live on the X chromosome. The Y chromosome is actually really, really small and doesn't have a lot of genes on it. Most of the genes on the Y chromosome are related to male traits. Otherwise, the X chromosome actually has genes on it that do more for the body than just determine like femaleness, essentially. So the X chromosome is a pretty important one. Most sex-linked traits are on the X-link or on an X chromosome. Then we have our other words, homozygous, heterozygous, which we're also already familiar with, 2 identical alleles versus 2 different alleles. Okay. So, hi Lane. We're happy to have you. Okay, who wants to read? That's right, read this lovely little paragraph here about what a pedigree is, or what you do with it. Any volunteers? I can also read it if you guys want. Thank you, Lissa. Let's go ahead and have you, I'm gonna unmute you. Go ahead.
Pedigrees are used to analyze the pattern of inheritance of a particular trait throughout a family. Pedigrees show the presence or absence of a trait as it relates to the relationship among parents, offspring, and siblings.
Awesome, thank you. So again, it's showing a pattern of inheritance. That's the key. It's going to be showing that amongst relationships, parents, siblings, offspring to parent, parents to their parents, etc. So we have a key in order to read this, which this is honestly maybe the most complicated part of the pedigree, is what all the boxes and things mean. So female people on the pedigree will be a circle. Males on the pedigree will be a square. Anybody who has the trait, right? So let's say it's a disease. or maybe it's a widow's peak, right? They would have a shaded either circle or square. That tells you, the reader of the pedigree, that they have the disease or the trait. If they're dead, they have a line crossed out through them. Other times, everyone in the pedigree will be dead, right? Because this is like an ancient thing. So then they don't put lines on all of them. They just leave it. If people are twins, they are shown coming from the same branch because they, in theory, have identical DNA, right? I say in theory because we assume that those are exact twins, right? Not non-identical. Adopted has these brackets around it. Will an adopted child or person in a family inherit traits from that family? No, right? They won't. However, we still want to include them because they're part of the family, right? And then this triangle means miscarriage, which means that, you know, that person did not develop completely into a baby. Now, that might seem like something that you're like, that doesn't seem like it would need to be on the pedigree. Well, some genetic diseases actually involve miscarriages, right? Where, depending on certain other factors, miscarriages might point to a trait in the family that's maybe just causing that to happen. It happens. So not only do we have all those symbols, then we also have all these lines. So we have marriage lines that are drawn between two people who are married. We then have lines coming off of the marriage that show the offspring. And again, these are biological children that were born from the marriage. We're not talking about adopted things here, right? Remember, the purpose of this is to show a trait traveling through a family. So it's not going to fit all family models, and it's not going to, you might even, if you did a pedigree of your family, you might have a ton of people in your family that you don't like, never talk to, or aren't really part of your family, but DNA-wise they are, right?
Yes.
Okay, so to read a pedigree, this is what one would look like in the wild. They usually number the people, and they number the generations. So we have our first generation, our second generation, our third generation. That way, I could say, third generation person 2, you know, do you think they would have this or whatever? And you would know exactly which person I'm talking about, right? Because you don't want to just say, that one at the bottom, because no one's going to know what you're talking about. So the numbers and generations are there to help you identify who's in the family and where they are in the family. So this one is showing the inheritance of freckles. Okay, the allele for freckles is dominant to the allele for no freckles. So this is a family. So the first thing you want to do, which they already told us up here, is figure out, well, what kind of trait is this? Is it autosomal, meaning it's on a regular autosomal chromosome? Is it sex-linked, where it might be on an X chromosome? Or is it recessive? Is it dominant? You know, is it causing people to die? What's happening, right? Those are all things that we can just look at right off at first glance. Now, there's a few ways you can tell. If something is a dominant trait, you will see it in every generation. Why? Why would we see a dominant trait in every generation? Is it more likely to be passed down? It's not necessarily more likely. That's a good guess, Lane. It's a 50-50 chance, right? Unless they have 2 dominant alleles. But Lissa's answer here is really great. Dominant genes are always expressed, or they always show, even if there's a recessive allele, right? So dominant is always going to be expressed. Now, that doesn't mean every person is going to have it. But if we look at this first family here, we have our dad and our mom, and they had 1, 2, 3 kids. We see 2 of those kids have freckles, 1 kid doesn't. That would make sense for dominant trait. Same thing here. We see this person got married to somebody without freckles, right, who's outside of the family, which is why they only have one marriage line here, and they produced 2 kids with freckles. This person who has a dominant freckle trait also produced at least 1 kid with freckles. So again, it doesn't have to be that every person's getting a dominant gene, but we see that it's happening through the generations here. So the next thing that we would want to do on a pedigree is we actually want to label what the genotypes are for our peoples, because our phenotypes are already given to us, right? Black here means they have freckles, white means they don't. So all of our white or recessive alleled people, what would their genotype be? Remember, genotype is the letters. Little f, little f. Good. So I could go through on every single one of these people. Oops. There we go. And write little f, right? I'm only going to do it on a few because obviously we understand everybody who is white here has little f's. Now, what about the people who have freckles? What genotypes could they have? So they could have big F, little f, or big F, big F. Person in the first generation, person 2, this lady right here with freckles, what do we think her genotype is? Big F, little f. You guys are getting this. Why? Well, she did have a kid who doesn't have freckles, which means she must have 1 recessive allele, right? So if that's true, then what do we know about person 3 here, generation 2, person 3, the square male? What would his genotype have to be? Big F, big F? Can it be 2 big Fs? You're telling me that this male child got a big F from his mom and from his dad? Maybe his other dad, but not that dad, right? This male has to be big F, little f, because there's no way that he could have inherited 2 big Fs. That means his children are also big F, little f, because again, there's no way that they could have inherited 2 big Fs because they have a recessive mother, right? So this one is a perfect example where you literally could figure out every single person's genotype here. Sometimes you'll get to a person and you're not sure. Sometimes you will get to a point where you say they could be heterozygous or homozygous dominant, and we don't know. Why do you guys think we wouldn't be able to tell? Like, what would be a situation you think where we're not sure? That's kind of a hard question, so I will help. Yeah, maybe if they're adopted, that's one thing, right? If we don't know their genetic history, or if they're marrying into the family, right? Like this person here did, person 1 over here, person 6, they married into the family. We don't know what their family background is. So if person 6 here was shaded in and did have freckles, they might have 2 dominant alleles. We don't know. We could maybe predict from their children, but we're not sure, right? So that's another thing. If the person hasn't had children yet, like they're the last generation, sometimes we can't tell until they've had children what their genotype is for sure. Again, we can narrow it down to one or the other, right, which is pretty good. But in some cases, there will be times when you say, no clue what this person's genotype is, it's one or the other. Okay, so that is basically pedigrees in a nutshell. Now we're going to look at an X-linked recessive situation. So remember, X-linked means it's on the X chromosome. So males have XY and females have XX. Who is more likely to inherit an X-linked disease, you think? Males or females? This is a harder question than you would think. I see female question marks, guesses, and then I see Georgia with the correct, perfect answer. Males, because they only have one X. This is an X-linked disease. So the way that we write these types of things in a Punnett square is we leave the X there to kind of show what's happening, but we would write X with a superscript, which I won't really put here because you can't really do it very well. Okay, let me think. Let me see how I can explain this the easiest way. So wouldn't double X's give the chance of the disease? So we're going to go through it right now, Lane. So an X-linked disease is hemophilia, which I don't know how to spell, so we'll assume that's right. I don't think it is. I think there's like an extra A or something in there. Hemophilia is recessive. So for something to be expressed when it's recessive, we usually need 2 copies, right? Okay. So we're going to represent this as a little h for hemophilia recessive. We would write this as X little h would be somebody who has a hemophilia trait. X with a capital H would be somebody who doesn't, right? Because this is a recessive allele. It's only going to be expressed if you have 2 recessive alleles. So let's say that you have a mom who doesn't have hemophilia. I wish I could write superscripts easily in this, but I can't. And we have a father who does have hemophilia. So he only has 1 X. So if he has hemophilia, he only needs 1 recessive allele. That is the exact reason why males have a higher chance of getting a recessive X-linked disease because they only need 1. So in this case, let's say that these people had children, right? We do our little Punnett square. And we have our X with a big H. We have our X with a big H. This is how you write it officially, by the way. You do these little superscript, tiny H's above the X, which is hard for me to write with the mouse, but I'm doing my best. Times the male, we would have an X with a little h and a Y. Wow. Okay. Like exponents, exactly. So our offspring choices would be that we would get X big H. Big H is really hard for me to write with the mouse. X little h. Little h, there we go. X big H. Y. X big H Y. Should have picked a letter that was easier to draw than H. And X big H, X little h. So we would have a 50% chance of having a male that doesn't have hemophilia and a 50% chance of having a female that doesn't have hemophilia. So nobody here would have it. We would, however, have 2 females that carry the trait. So what would happen in that case? If we have a cross between a woman who does, actually, let's say a male who has hemophilia, and a woman who's a carrier, but she doesn't have it, what would happen? Some of you can probably already guess. Okay. So a male with hemophilia marries a woman who's a carrier in this case. Pretty rare situation. Interestingly enough, though, a male who has hemophilia can't actually pass on that hemophilia trait to other males that he produces. Why not? A male that has hemophilia an X-linked recessive disease cannot pass on hemophilia to his children that are male. Why? He gives Y, not X. Exactly. To be male, you have to have a Y chromosome. Where are you getting that Y chromosome from? Your dad, right? So he can't actually pass on that hemophilia trait to his son. He can pass it on to his daughter, though. So in this case, we would get an X big H, X little h. So we would get a woman who's a carrier. We would get X big H, Y. So we would get a male who doesn't have it. We would get X little h. So we would get a female who has hemophilia. And we would get X little h, Y. We would get a male that also has hemophilia. So their children would have a 50% chance of getting hemophilia, right? No matter which sex they are, they could get it. So this is sort of why knowing these things is important. Because hemophilia, for example, is a very intense disease, right? Where you bleed to death from the tiniest little cuts and scrapes. Kind of important to know about, especially if it runs in your family and maybe you're a carrier and you don't know, right? Not such a huge problem in modern day. Does anyone know when hemophilia, like historically, sort of became a big deal and a big problem? Any ideas? When a Russian royal son had it. You're right, Lane. You want to know why? Inbreeding. Inbreeding brought out hemophilia. Fun times, right? That means people in the family mating with other people in the family. You know, blue blood, keeping the royal blood, right? That was an important thing. That really screwed up genetics because inbreeding is not supposed to happen, right? For obviously moral reasons, you may think that it's disturbing, but in addition to moral reasons, genetic reasons, right? The genetic reasons being that you have a smaller gene pool to work from. So if you're dealing with something like an X-linked recessive trait like hemophilia, and you have a small gene pool, that's a problem. Okay, so this one is actually showing color blindness, which is another very common X-linked recessive trait, right? Hemophilia is a good example. Color blindness is another good example. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to look to see kind of the patterns. So straight up, just looking at this pedigree versus the other pedigree, what are you noticing about this pedigree? Do we see a lot of people with the trait? No. Does that make sense? Yes, because we don't see a lot of people that are colorblind, right? It's rare. Rare. It still happens. So that's a good signal to you that it might be recessive. Now, what else do you notice? Are females affected by this? Do any women in this pedigree have color blindness? No, right? Lane's right. They can have it, of course. Much more rare. In this case, though, we don't see any women having the trait. That immediately should signal to you this is X-linked. If it's mostly affecting males, it's not in every generation. Georgia pointed that out, right? That the first generation, nobody has the trait. These are all signs to say recessive, X-linked. Why else would more males get it? Right? Now, again, what if they only had male children or something like that, right? Then it might change your mind. So again, we could predict people's genotypes because we know anybody with the trait is going to be X little b. They're using a B for color blindness. Y, right? That's all our males with the trait are going to be X little b, Y. We then can figure out which females were carriers because remember, males get the Y chromosome from their dad. So their dad, for example, dad here first generation dad 1, right? He isn't colorblind. He's going to have X big B, Y. That means his wife. She's the one who introduced it into the family with her X big B, X little b. Why? Because she's not colorblind, but she must carry the trait in order for her kid to get it. That means her daughters are also carriers, right? Which is how her daughter's son ended up having color blindness. And notice it sort of skipped a generation on this side, right? But reappeared later. So women are often secret carriers of these things. They don't have any phenotype expression of it. They don't know they have it, right? Because you wouldn't know this unless color blindness runs in your family. Then maybe you might suspect you're a carrier, right? But usually people find these things out from this. Or all of a sudden their kid's colorblind and they're like, what's going on, right? Well, that's what's going on. Okay. So that is pedigrees in a nutshell, right? The rest of this link that I gave to you does talk about, some misconceptions, which is helpful for us to look at. So just because a lot of people have it doesn't mean it's dominant, right? It might. Again, if you think it's dominant, you go through and say, okay, if this trait was dominant, what would people's genotypes be? Does it work? Most traits are not dominant. I will say that, right? At least most traits that show up in pedigrees. And you may not always be able to determine the genotype, which we talked about a little bit, right? You might get down to knowing that they have the trait and they could be 2 things, or that they don't have the trait and they could be 2 things. So you may not know. All right, that was Pedigrees 101. Again, I'm going to paste the link here in case you were late and didn't get it. Now, here is your opportunity to get some bonus points. You can take the Khan Academy quiz on pedigrees, and if you get 100%, you will get 5 bonus points added to whatever you want. So there's a link to the quiz. It's just 4 questions based on the information that we just talked about, right? Here's another great example of an X-linked recessive trait, muscular dystrophy, right? Very sad one. So you are going to try to answer these questions, right? And this will help you sort of understand genetics a little bit more. If you do this, right, you can take the quiz multiple times, I'm pretty sure. If you get all 4 right, it'll say 100%. I think you can click retake if it doesn't, and you can try again. If you get all 4 questions right and you send me a screenshot of your results, I will give you 5 bonus points on whatever you want of your choice. So again, quiz, totally optional. You can even just do it for fun if you want, because it is kind of interesting, right? It's like a puzzle. You can approach it as a puzzle. Like, I'm trying to figure out what happened here, who has the disease, which type of disease is it dominant, is it recessive, who's inheriting it, etc. You could even try to create a pedigree for your own family if you'd like, right? Maybe try something like a widow's peak, something that's pretty easy to see and tell if people have. All right, otherwise, this is the last virtual session. We talked a lot last week about all the different things that you have coming up, right? Make sure you get your genetics project done. If there's an opportunity for you to have a pedigree in there that you explain, do it, right? Because they can be helpful. Otherwise, you don't have to force one, because some disorders and diseases aren't necessarily inherited in such a easy way, which we also have talked about. All right, so does anyone have any questions about this? By the way, people that don't come to the session are gonna have to complete the quiz instead. So that'll be fun for them. But it's a fun quiz, maybe. Yeah, so take the link to the quiz, do the quiz if you want those 5 bonus points. Otherwise, they're to turn in for this, It's just going to be for people who weren't here. So if you were in the virtual session, you're going to write a special code word. That's the special code word. Very creative on my part, right? So you're going to write that in the assignment for today to get excused from it, right? You don't have to take the quiz, totally optional. If you do take the quiz, you get 5 bonus points unless you're not here, and then you have to take it. Blah, blah, blah. So much to say. All right. Otherwise, do you guys have any questions? Okay. Bonnie says no. I'll take that as the general consensus for everyone here. If you do have a question, you email me. All right. So I will see you guys in second semester. But I'll still be communicating with you. Get your grade where you want it. You've got a couple weeks left, right? Get your assignments and get your genetics project done. All right. Bye, everyone.